Hi everyone, let's continue our discussion on securing single page applications with Spring Security. We are following this architecture where we will have a UI or gateway server which will be responsible for serving the Angular application and for routing the request to resource server. We will have one resource server which will be responsible to store and secure the resources. Then we have third component which is authorization server which is responsible for authenticating and authorizing the users. And since we are using OAuth2 for authentication and authorization, UI server acts as a OAuth2 client, resource server as OAuth2 resource server, and authorization server as OAuth2 authorization server. And the resource owner will be the user who is using our application. Now in the previous video, we have created a resource server and we have already created an OAuth2 authorization server. You can find all these videos in this playlist, so go ahead and watch it. Also, you can find all the source code in this GitHub repository. I will put all these links in the description. Now we need to build UI or gateway server. And since this is a client as well, so we will call it OAuth2 Client. Now to create an OAuth2 client in Spring, we can use OAuth 2.0 client dependency of the Spring. For more information, you can visit this documentation. I will put the link in the description. Now let's get started. So to create a Spring Boot project, either you can go to Spring Initializer website, which is start.spring.io, or you can use your ID if the ID supports that. I will use ID. You can create on file, new project. The name of the project will be, or let's say client auth2, and I will choose the location for the project. For language, I will obviously choose Java, and the project will be of type Maven. Group I will choose as dev.jawaras.auth2. Artifact will be client auth2. This will be the package name, which is fine. We are using Java version 17. Packaging will be jar. Let's click on next. Now since our client or UI server will be gateway server as well, that means it needs to have the capability to route the request to resource server. So we need to build a gateway server, and to build a gateway server we can use Spring Cloud Gateway dependency. So just search for gateway, and we want to build a OAuth2 client, so we can choose OAuth2 client. So we only need these two dependencies for now. Let's click on create. I will click on cancel, and here, not this one, it is client OAuth2 home.xml. Right click and add as Maven project. Maybe I go to source main Java here, and I should be able to run the application. Let's run the client. For now, let's create a simple home controller. I will click here, new Java class, and I want that to be inside home, home.home controller. This will be REST controller, and yeah, it will be the default endpoint, so we don't need to specify anything. Let's say get mapping, public string get hello. If you don't specify any path here, so it will be empty path, that means default path. And let's return hello world. So this is our home controller. So once we are logged in, we should be able to see hello world. We can use this password, but I don't want that. What we want is we want to log in using authorization server, and then we should be able to access this controller. Now, since this is an OAuth2 client, so we need to do some configuration for it to work. So you can find all the configuration in this documentation. So if you go here, in core interfaces and classes, OAuth2 authorization grants, or go to OAuth2 login or configurations. Yes, here. Here, and that's yeah, here. So you can find all the configuration here, and I will explain some of them which are necessary for our use case. So let's go to application.properties file inside OAuth2 client. First of all, I want to run client application on port 8081. So let's define that server.port 8081. Now we need to define some configuration for the OAuth2 client. So this is spring.security.auth2 client.registration. Now after registration, we need to specify registration ID, which can be any unique string in all the registrations. So you may configure this client to have multiple authorization servers, and to differentiate between those servers, we need to specify some unique registration ID for each configuration. So let's just define client here, and after that we need to specify the provider. So here are two things. First is registration ID, and then second is provider. So you can think provider as authorization server and registration ID as the client inside that authorization server. So if you remember, we have created one client inside that authorization server. So all the configuration which we will do for this client will be related to the client which we created in the authorization server, and all the configuration for this provider will be related to the authorization server, not for the client. So keep that in mind. So here for provider as well, we can define any string here, and then whenever we will do configuration for that provider, that will be applied here. So let's say Spring here, and now we need to configure this provider as well. So for that, let's just say spring dot security auth2 dot client dot not client dot provider. Now here will be name of the provider, and we have specified Spring here. So Spring dot. Now there are many configuration for provider as well. Let's just say is your URI here. Now let's first configure the client, and then we will come to the provider. So the first configuration was is specifying the provider name. So we have specified the provider here. Now let's copy this, Control V dot. Now the next is client ID. So, so this client ID should be same as the client ID which we defined while creating client in the authorization server. So if you go to authorization server, source main Java config, authorization server config, and here. This is the client which we have defined here. So let's close this for now, and we will open these two files so that it's easy to see what we have defined and what we need to define. We can open let right. Okay, and here I will say view active editor and software app. Editor software app. Okay, so client ID, we have defined client as the client ID, so I can say client, then client secret this, and client secret will be secret, since that is what we have defined here. Next we need to define authorization grant type. So when you authorization grant type, so this is the grant type which we want to use, and we can use from these one. See here we have defined authorization grant type, authorization code, client credential, and refresh token. So we can use any one of them here, and let's choose authorization code because that's what we want to use, and that's the common way when we want to log in the user. Let's see what's its value. So if you go to authorization code, and we need this code here, and don't worry, this is a standard code, you can find it here and you can find it in the documentation as well. After that, let's copy it. The next one is redirect URI. So redirect URI is the URI where you will be redirected after successful authentication, and that we have already defined here 9000 auth. But in this case, we can't use this because we need a valid redirect URI. Otherwise, we won't be able to get the access token. So for that, we can use base URL. So base URL, this will be injected by Spring automatically, and its value will be the domain where your application is running. So it will be like this. So base URL will be like, first it will be this one. That means the host name, then port, and port we will specify 8081, and then path, and path is empty. So we can see that in the logs as well. So if you go to the logs, and you will see net is started, port 8080 is started here. Okay, I think here, yes, here you can see Tomcat is started on port 8080 with context path empty. So in when we create application using Spring Boot and packaging is jar, then in the almost all of the cases the path will be empty. And if we want to change the path, you can do using server dot path, I guess, server dot servlet dot context path, and then you can specify, like, for example, client. In that case, your application will run on HTTP localhost 8081 client, this path. Then base URL will automatically change. So you don't need to worry about that. So I will just remove it. So this is the base URL, and after base URL, okay, yeah, this will be your base URL. And after base URL, you need to provide login, OAuth2 code, and then this ID, this registration ID. So registration ID also Spring can inject automatically. We'll just say registration ID here. The final redirect URI will be after base URL we need to put these things, and instead of registration ID it will be replaced by Spring with client because that is the registration ID here, client. Now we need to put this redirect URI here in the authorization server configuration. Otherwise, if the redirect URI are different, then the authorization server will deny the requests. So this one. So that's about redirect URI. Now we need to specify the scopes which we want to request. So that also we can specify dot scope. So we can specify multiple scopes. So what we can do is you can say 0 equal to, let's say, OpenID scope 1 equals to profile. But keep in mind that you can only specify the scopes which you have defined in the authorization server while creating the client. Let's say since we have defined two scopes here, one is profile, second is OpenID. So the value of this profile is profile in a small case. So we can specify that OpenID has value OpenID in a small case. So we can specify that here. We can specify only one as well. So like if you don't want to specify profile, it will work, but you cannot specify something else like, for example, email. If you do that, then authorization server will throw error. So just keep that in mind. So let's open our email profile because we have specified these two scopes here. Or if you don't want to write this in multiple lines, what you can do is you can just have a scope here, and then you can have, let's say, profile comma OpenID. This will also work. So this will split the strings by comma and will create an array. Now we need to specify the client name. So let me copy it. Out client name. So client name is basically suppose you have a button where it will be written like login with this thing, login with that. So there this client name will be used. So let's say login with mm, login with Spring provider or something like that. Let's keep it that. So these are all the configuration. There are more configuration as well. Like one more configuration is client authentication method. Client authentication method. So you can use this as well. So this will be the method how you want to authenticate the client while accessing the request token. Sorry, while accessing the access token. And we have specified that here client authentication method. So you need to use this as well. So if you don't specify it, it will use that one by default. Let's just don't specify it. Or you can specify if you want. So let's go here, and if it's a client secret basic, let's do that. Okay. Now these are all the configuration related to the client, and these should match what we have specified in authorization server while creating the client. Now let's configure the provider. So in the provider there are mm, some configurations. So the first is your URI. So let's say is your URI is same as which we have defined in the authorization server. which is the URL of the authorization server, that is http localhost 8083. Yeah, that's it. So this is the issue URI. Now there are many more configuration as well. I copy this, paste it here, and you can see there are many configuration authorization URI. So I will just talk about them. I won't define them here, and why not? I will tell you that as well. So is URI, we know it is the URI of the authorization server. Second is authorization URI. This is the URI where login page will be presented. And after successful login, we will get the authorization code. Third is JWK set URI. So this is JSON Web Key Set URI. So this is the URL from where client will access the keys in order to decode the tokens. Then there is token URI. So this is used to get the access token or ID token from the authorization server. Then there is user info authentication method. So this is the like to get the user information, we need to send a URL to the authorization server. And with this request, we need to send the client credentials. So how do we want to send the client credentials? We'll go here. Then there is user info URI. And where do we want to send that request? Because to get the user information, there should be some endpoint in the authorization server where we want to send the or where we should send the request, and that is called user info URI. Then there is user name attribute. So this is the to get the unique ID for the user. In the ID token, what field we need to access. So for example, your user, let's say you get this in the ID token. Let's say name, here some name, uh, email, then some email, then let's say you have ID, then this, then let's say you have sub. So now if you see, or let's say instead of name, you have username here. Now in this case, which one should you consider to be unique? Always. So that's what we want to provide there. If you don't provide, this sub will be used, and that's the default which is implemented by the Spring authorization server. So we don't need to mention that here. Now we did not mention all other as well. So like all these configuration we did not mention. So since we have enabled OpenID protocol in the authorization server. So if you see here, we have enabled OpenID here. So if we have enabled OpenID, so if any authorization server has OpenID enabled, then that authorization server provide a OpenID configuration endpoint, and that endpoint has all of these configuration. All these configurations are available in that OpenID configuration endpoint. And what OAuth2 client does is it calls that endpoint and it will inject all these values from that response. But in some cases, OAuth2 authorization servers do not implement OpenID. In that case, we need to specify all these configurations or whatever configurations are required in our use case. But since we are already using OpenID protocol on top of OAuth2, so we don't need to specify all these things. So what this client will do is this will take this is your URI, and after that, so for example, this is your URI. So after that, it will add dot well known OpenID configuration. So it will append that and it will use that information to inject all those configurations. And we have already seen in the previous video that resource server also does the same. So let's copy this for now. And since our authorization server is running, so uh, we can go here, and if we see, we got the response. So let's zoom in, and we can see we have issuer here, authorization endpoint, this device authorization endpoint. This is to authenticate device. Token endpoint auth method supported, and all of the information is available here. So we don't need to worry about that. That's why we have only specified the issuer URI here. So now we are done with configuring the OAuth2 client. Now let's restart the authorization server because we have changed the redirect URI here, and here resource server is running, but we have not changed anything, so I won't restart it. I will restart the client because obviously in client we have made significant changes, so I will restart it as well. So authorization server is running and this client OAuth2 application is also running. Now let's open a new incognito window. Go to localhost 8081 because this is the URL of the client server. And yeah, I will open network tab. And you see, since we are not logged in, so we are redirected to login. Let's put username and password. And this username and password we have already defined in the authorization server. Click on sign in. And we can see the hello world here. So we can see hello world. That means this is working. Now let's send a request from client to resource server. And how do we do that? So what we want to do is we cannot just use this. We cannot just say like 8082 and then so in the if you see in the resource server, so I will open the resource server here. In the resource server OAuth2 source main Java controller, we have a demo controller and its path is hello. We cannot just use the URL of the authorization server, sorry, URL of the resource server and hello here. Why? Because we are not logged in the resource server. We are logged in the client server, but not in the authorization server. So what we want is, since we are logged in the client, we have access token. So we want to send that access token to the resource server from the client server, and we should be able to access the resources. So that means we want to propagate or we want to route the request from client to resource. And that's where the gateway server comes into place. And since we have already added the dependency for gateway server in the client application, so we can use or we can configure the routes to route to the resource server. Let's do that. So I will create new Java class, and let's say since this is particular to the gateway configuration, so I will give it gateway, and let's say route configuration, and configuration annotation, and here we need to specify some routes. Close this. Okay, so we need to return a bean of type route config. Route configuration, no, not route configuration. I think route locator, yes. Route locator. And this I have already explained in the video with the title like building gateway server. So this is a video building a gateway server. So you can see that video as well, how to create a gateway server. Route locator, and let's say route locator. It will take one parameter called route locator builder. Route locator builder, let's say builder, and return builder dot routes dot build. But before returning it, we want to build some routes. So let's say dot build a route. Let's say first we have a route R. We want to send all the requests to resource server. If the requests are of type this, so let's say we make a request to http localhost 8081, because we need to send the request to client server only, because we are authenticated to the client server, not to resource server. And if we see this resource, and let's say hello, we want to route this request to localhost 8082 hello. Now let's see how do we do that. So route R. So first we need to identify if we need to route this request. So I will say r dot path. That means if path is path satisfies this regular expression, that means resource. So if there is resource at the start of the path, in that case I want to route the request. And where do I want to route the request to? Dot URI. So the so what URI does is it replace the domain with the provided value. So it will replace this thing with the provided value, and we want to route to here. So it will be this one, right? But what will happen that this request will become this. But these two are not same, because we need to remove these resources from the path. For that we can add a filters, and let's say add one filter, rewrite path. So we can rewrite the path. So first is regular expression, so which is resource, and I want to replace this resource with just this slash. That means this whole thing will be replaced with this slash. So now you can see these two requests are, or these two URLs are the same. This is how it will work. Now let's restart the client application at 0 at 1. We need to log in again. We are logged in. Now after at 1, I will say resource and hello. So you can see uh, still we are getting 401. So you can see here hello 401 unauthorized. What's happening here? So the thing is, we are routing the request to resource server, but we are not sending the token. So to send the token, we have one another filter which is called token relay. So if we use token relay, then our to tokens will also be sent to resource server. So let's restart it. Okay. Let's refresh the page. Now since we have restarted, and we are storing everything in the memory, so session was also stored in the memory. So we need to log in again. Java, Rust, AWS, sign in, and yep, we are able to send the request to the resource server, and you can see we got the response back. and hello, and this is the username. So that's how we communicate between client server, resource server, and authorization server. So in the OAuth 2.0, the workflow is we get an authorization code from authorization server. Then again, we exchange that code with authorization server with a access token. And then we send that access token to the resource server. And then resource server communicates with authorization server to validate that access token. And if everything is fine, then a resource server allows us to access the resources. Now in the next videos, we will serve Angular applications from this UI or gateway server, and then this architecture will be complete. So that's for the next videos. That's it in this video. If you found this video to be useful, please like and share it, and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching the video. We will meet in the next video. Until then, bye and take care.